All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining Weekend Wellness. My name is Ramki. I'm the physical therapist at RVA Physical Therapy and Sports Rehab. Most of you know me, some of you don't know me, but whatever it is, please spread the word. We're trying to bring in a lot of speakers, just at least during the quarantine, so that we all can be educated. Please pass it to your friends, family. You know, this Zoom account is dedicated mainly for this. The purpose is to educate people. And as soon as the presentation is done, within the next 24 hours to 36 hours, we will post it on Facebook under the page called Weekend Wellness. So please do go and look up all the presentations. So far, we have had 6. And I tried to bring in different presenters with different topics. But the ultimate goal is during this time, exercise, exercise, exercise. This is not the time for relaxing just at home, not doing anything. Go for a good walk, improve your lung function. That way you can prevent the worst from happening. So today's topic is on keep on running. I know most of my running friends are here. Arun Samuel Jaykumar is one of my colleagues from back in India. We did our bachelor's together in Ramchandra. Arun Samuel right now is working as a clinical lead physiotherapist and advanced physiotherapy practitioner in Kent, UK. And he has been treating runners for over 10 years now, and also has been presenting on topics related to running. He has actually presented and educated a lot of young physiotherapists recently, and he has started his own podcast. And Sam, if at all possible, if you could share that link from your podcast towards the end, that'll be awesome. And any questions, please wait till the end, because we're going to, allow him to present his entire slides, and then we'll ask all the questions. I've already had a couple of questions, Arun, that people have sent me. So I'm going to ask them in the end, okay?
Okay, man.
So the screen is yours. You can go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you, Ramki. Thanks everybody for making the time to be available this evening. As Ramki said, my name is Arun Samuel Jaykumar, and I'm a clinical lead physiotherapist and advanced physiotherapy practitioner. What that means here in the UK is that apart from having my physiotherapists team, and in my organization there's about 25 physios, the role of advanced physiotherapy practitioner is more of a triage clinician. So I get to refer patients on for MRI scans, bone scans, x-rays, and I also administer soft tissue and joint injections and things like that. And that's a different part of my role. So as Ramki said, a brief introduction of myself is I've been treating runners for a number of years. I do treat and teach courses on this particular topic. So I'm hoping to impart a little bit of knowledge on running per se, and if you are keen on running, and if you are a runner, I'm going to talk to you about strategies that you could probably use to improve performance, to prevent injuries to a degree. So yeah, I'm hoping to share the stuff that I know with all of you. I hope all of you can hear me well, and I'm just going to move ahead now. Thank you for your time again. So this is where I work. The name of the organization is Medway Community Healthcare. It's MCH in short, and that is our building there that you can see. And we've got some really good facilities. We're based in Kent in the UK. And I live in the countryside here in the UK, and of course, with the current situation with the COVID-19 lockdown, a lot more people appear to be running as well, which is great. Hopefully, this will also give you a little bit more information. So that's a little bit about me. Now, what I'm going to talk about through the course of this presentation, these are my objectives in terms of what I want to share with you guys. So I'm going to firstly talk to you about what I call the running revolution. And what I really mean by that is the number of people that now run in the general population. And that is increasing phenomenally. And that not only in the developed countries, but also in the developing countries. And I'm going to share some stats with you all, just to give you a bit of a brief understanding on that. I'm also going to talk to you about some of the health benefits associated with running, and those of you who already run will obviously be aware of some of these things, but I'm going to try and break things down a little bit more. And sadly, you also have to sort of consider things like the sort of injuries that are associated with running, and I'm going to talk to you about the factors that, in my opinion, are really important in this context. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about injury prevention. I've coined this core four, and that means that I've got four different aspects that I often pay attention to when I'm educating people on injury prevention in long distance runners, and that's essentially what we're talking about. Anything above and beyond 1,500 meters, and that probably amounts for a lot of the population now. So let me start with the running revolution, and I've got some statistics here, and I just cast your attention on. I mean, this is how things are in the UK at the moment. So about 7 million people in the UK run, and that is a population in a country that has a population of around 67, 68 million at the moment, I think. On average, most of these runners run at least twice a week. And 50% of them participate in events like 5K and 10K runs, and 5K runs, so that's 5-kilometer runs, are really popular, not only here in the UK, they're popular everywhere in the world. And a smaller percentage of the people participate in longer events, so things like your marathons and half marathons, and also triathlons, of course. And some stats I've got here from the US. Back in 2017, 55.9 million people classified themselves as runners, and these are all census statistics. And also, if we look at some of the people who registered for competitive events, so again, things like 5K and 10K runs, 18 million people participated in those in 2017. Now, there's other countries, some countries in Europe. So, for instance, Netherlands, for example, has, or some of the Scandinavian countries in particular, have the highest public participation, as high as 20% of general population in some Scandinavian countries actually run on a regular basis. So that's a pretty big stat. But here's something that is particularly shocking for me, particularly. So if you look at the years from 2008 to 2018, and if you look at the growth of running in that time period, in that decade, the highest percentage of increase is in India, or was in India rather, and the percentage increase was 228%. And if you look at the same period and the public participation in running in other countries, it was 49%, and that's all the other countries put together. So in a lot of the developing world, running is catching on big time. So that's a few stats there for you to sort of reflect on, and that's how big running is. And I'm talking about the general population here. I want to make that clear. I'm not talking about elite athletes. So running is one of these activities that most of us can partake in, and all you need is a pair of trainers, and off you go running, and you don't need gym memberships and personal trainers and so on and so forth. It does have some drawbacks, and we'll discuss that a little bit more in detail. But it's one of the most easily accessible forms of exercise. Now, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about health benefits associated with running, and this is one of the reasons as to why a lot of runners do run. I'll start with some of the morbid details. So first thing I'll say is mortality related to heart disease is lower in runners, and lower by 45 to 70%. So these are all statistics that have been taken from really big studies and general population studies. And if you look at another condition, so mortality related to cancer is lower by between 30 to 50% in amongst runners. So what this means is that if you compare non-runners to runners, runners appear to have a much lower rate of mortality in relating to these particular conditions. And a couple of other things that I would point out, or even other neurological conditions, so things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's diseases, and it seems to have a protective nature against mortality relating to these conditions as well. And some of the reasons for this are improved cardiorespiratory fitness is one thing that we all benefit from when we partake in running, and of course things like it also has a profound effect on blood pressure, and it lowers blood pressure is what I'm referring to here, and in particular the lower figure, so the diastolic blood pressure, and it also increases the HDL cholesterol. And to those of us, forgive me if I'm stating things that you already know here, but just to make things clear, so HDL cholesterol, you want that to be higher, you want the LDL cholesterol to be lower. That is essentially what you want. And running or any other physical exercise, to be honest, increases the rate of HDL cholesterol, and that's essentially what we all want. And besides that, it also has an effect on blood sugar control. And of course, mental health benefits are also significant. So if we think about things like, depression symptoms and also improving cognitive function, increasing alertness and things like that, it also has an effect on all of these things. So there's a lot going for running and for runners, and hence, I think that the amount of participation in it. So if I move ahead and look at some of the sort of physical activity recommendations, so these recommendations are based on the World Health Organization's statistics and guidance that was published in 2010, and then the Chief Medical Officer here in the UK also published their own statistics, and this is their recommendation. So they've recommended that we partake in 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercises per week, or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity exercises, or a combination of both. So some of this and some of that, but some level of activity. This is for ages between 16 and 60, so quite a big age group. And the reason for this recommendation, again, is I will put up a few sort of statistics on the right side of your screens here. So we're talking about conditions like diabetes, so type 2 diabetes, in particular cardiovascular diseases, and some of the mental health illnesses that seem to have a high prevalence at the moment. So all of these conditions, it seems to reduce the chances of you developing these conditions. So that's some of the sort of health benefits associated with running, some of the guidelines that have been published across many parts of the world. And I suppose these are the reasons as to why running has caught on so much. So I'm going to discuss a couple of negative things in relating to runners and running in particular. Now we know that the rate of injuries in runners is quite high, and to be honest, it depends on the paper that you look at. They seem to range between, the statistics seem to range between 30% to 70%, depending on the paper that you read. Rather than beating around too much, I've pulled off a couple of stats here for you to look at again, and I'm on this slide, I'm going to concentrate on novice runners. And what I mean by novice runners are people who started running or who've been running for less than 6 months, and that's how research also seems to classify a novice runner. And these group of runners seem to be at great risk of developing injuries. Now, this one particular study concluded that more than 11% of novice runners report injury within the first week, within the first 6 weeks of starting a running program. And if you look at some of the other papers, so novice runners are seemingly at a much greater risk of developing injury. So there's a few things here, and this is one of the things that I would be point to as well. So 23% of the novice runners in this particular study stopped running after having started a program. And they cited that the reason as to why they never returned to running was because they developed an injury after having started running. So we seem to be, although running is growing exponentially, we seem to be losing a lot of these guys who start running, and it appears that injury seems to be one of the biggest causes for it. And that's why I'm quite passionate about trying to make sure that we get the best advice out there in terms of trying to stop some of this from happening, and people try and maintain or retain some of these people that enthusiastically get on to running. So those are a few stats, and I felt it was essential that all of us understood that there's a big role for us as health professionals, and for us to sort of pass on good information, good quality information to you guys. Now, a couple of other things that I want to sort of point out. If you look at age groups, and I mentioned masters runners and I mentioned young runners. So masters runners, according to all of the research that's done in this area, is people who run, people on the other side of 40, so people who are over 40 years of age. Anything below that appears to be a younger runner. And if you look at some of the statistics again, we find actually that in masters runners, the kind of injuries that masters runners seem to suffer with is very different, and what I would say is based on, again, all the research. Soft tissue injuries are far more common in masters runners, so things like calf injuries, so recurrent calf muscle injuries, calf tears, and so on and so forth, hamstring injuries, Achilles, and that's the Achilles tendon. That again, I mean, it's a certain. All of these soft tissue conditions seem to be far more prevalent in the masters age group. Whereas if you look at the younger runners, we're looking at other types of injuries. So injuries around the knee, so things like, you may have heard of terms like runner's knee or ITB pain. So these sort of scenarios seem to be more common in younger runners. And of course, there's other type of injury known as bone stress injury. And they're bone stress injuries, sorry, and they are basically stress fractures of various degrees, various categories. So these kind of injuries are far more common in younger runners, and it appears that there are a few reasons for this. Now, as we get older, we seem to sort of suffer certain changes. So things like, naturally we tend to shorten our stride length, it appears, and also the speed of running appears to reduce. And this is the big factor. The calf muscle power seems to reduce by about 49%, and that's big. That's big loss of muscle power. And of course, also things like muscle mass. You know, that's not just pertaining to calf. We're talking about other muscles in the lower limb, as in the leg per se. But we seem to lose muscle mass a lot after the age of 40. And maybe this is the reason as to why we develop more soft tissue injuries. So you know, there are certain effects. And if you look at some of the other central effects, centralized in other general physiological effects. Now, things like reduction in maximal heart rate. And as we seem to get older, after the age of 20, we seem to, the maximal heart rate tends to drop by around 0.7% per year of life. So, these things seem to matter, but I would say focus on the top right corner of this particular slide. So looking primarily in this sort of area here, and this for us is really important, and this is something we can change. And that is why I want you to focus on this. So I'll talk to you a little bit more in detail about how we can improve these factors. Now, we can't talk about running injuries and running injury prevention without talking about what runners believe. And this is a very good study that was done in 2019 in Holland, which I incidentally mentioned earlier, that has a high participation in running in amongst general population. And what they've found is they interviewed, or they surveyed rather, over 1,000 experienced runners, and these were the findings of that particular survey. Now, what they found was that what they reported was that 79% of those over 1,000 people reported a running-related injury at some point during that course of that calendar year. And 76% of them believed that running shoes, here we call them trainers. I know in the States, I believe you call them Snickers or whatever, I don't know, or sneakers, sorry. Snickers is a bar of chocolate, I must say. So anyway, so 76% of people believed that the running shoes were important in preventing injuries. Now that's a very controversial thing, and I've got my own take on that, and I want to share that with you a little bit later. And stretching, 50% of them felt that stretching was also really important in preventing injuries. But again, the research on that is not particularly unequivocal. So I wouldn't necessarily support that. The last point in red here that you can see on my screen, or your screen, sorry, is the one that made me hang my head in shame, I must say. And what it said was that only 13% of those over 1,000 runners felt that they could get information from a health professional on running and injury prevention. In fact, more of them, so 15% of them, believed that they could get better information from running stores. So running stores are shops that sell running shoes, basically. So I think this is where I suppose some of us as health professionals need to pick up our game a little bit and try and educate people a little bit better to sort of make them trust in us a little bit more, I suppose. But anyway, this is these. But there were a couple of good positives as well at the study. So one is 94% of them believed that a gradual progression, a progressive training plan was important in preventing running injuries, and that is really important. And 68% of them actually searched for information on preventing running injuries on the internet primarily. So this one particular study is as important, and has informed me a lot. I thought it would be a good thing to share with you guys today. Now, look, this slide for me is all about my opinion. And this is my order of importance as to the kind of things that are important in preventing running injuries. Okay, so for me, no injury is caused by one particular factor. They're caused by multiple factors, and that's what I want to highlight here. So I'll start with this pyramid sort of model, and the reason I've used this particular picture is because what I mean by loads here are the loads of running. So how much you run, whether you're referring to the frequency, as in the number of times per week that you run, or whether you're referring to the intensity of your running. So all of that I would fit in this category. And this is based on my experience primarily. So most runners that I treat have been injured as a result of training load errors. So too much too soon. Okay, you would have seen that, it's nothing new, but in my experience, training load errors, amount to the biggest percentage of running injuries that I tend to see. And the next thing that I mentioned here is bone and muscle capacity, essentially the capacity of your muscles and on your bones to tolerate the load of running, and that's that's the next factor in my book, if you like. And the last thing is recovery and rest. Now, this is often something that is underestimated a lot, right? So when I say recovery and rest, I'm referring to two things. So recovery is the time in between your runs. So if you're starting a new program, if you've never run before, what's important is to make sure that you run space your runs, or run 3 times a week, perhaps at most, but make sure that you get at least that 48-hour gap in between, and that's for recovery, physiological recovery to happen. And rest is essentially sleep. and is again one of those things that is not given enough importance, and is particularly common at this time of the year. Normally, this is the sort of the time of the year when running kicks off in this country. When I say that, what I mean is competitive events like marathons and stuff. In fact, tomorrow would have been the London Marathon. Obviously, that's been cancelled. So when I say rest and recovery, I'm referring to frequency of running. I'm also referring to the rest, as in the amount of sleep. And there's a lot of research that has proven that if you sleep less than 7 hours over a 14-day period, you are more likely to develop an injury pertaining to running. Okay, so there's every reason to make sure that you get enough rest, you space your runs out, and also make sure you get enough sleep. And it's one of those things that we don't tend to regard very much because we all have busy lives. But these things are important. If you can't, I definitely mentioned that in here. So look, when I talk about training loads or running loads, now this slide I'm going to use to explain what I mean in this context. So look, this glass of water that you can see on the top left side of your screen is essentially the current level of fitness. Now, you can apply this to somebody who has not run and is beginning a program of running, or for somebody who is a seasoned, experienced runner but wants to participate in the marathon. So they start a 4-month program or a 3-month program to sort of train for the marathon. In both those scenarios, this description applies. Okay, so current level of fitness in this context is this glass of water with the water in it is the current level of fitness. Okay, now if we then talk about new exercise load, and that in this instance obviously is running is what we're talking about, right? So that is the water dripping, extra water dripping into the tumbler. Okay, and that is the newer load. And what happens is the amount of water obviously builds up in the glass. Now, if you are a novice runner and have started running more like 4 or 5 times a week, having never run before, the amount of activity that you're actually subjecting your body to is completely different to what you previously were, which then means that it builds up, the amount of water in the glass builds up, and that eventually leads to this overflow mechanism, and that's what I would call an injury. Okay. And you could again use the same example for an experienced runner. And if you, let's say you decided to do a marathon and signed up for a 4-month or a 16-week plan, but you fell ill, or you were particularly busy at work for the first 3 or 4 weeks, and then decided to do a 16-month program in 12 months, 16-week program in 12 weeks, then your increase in mileage is going to be a lot more steep, and that obviously is not going to allow for the physiological changes in your body to happen, and hence you will again lead, or it will again lead to this overflow, hence an injury. So that's what I'm referring to when I say a new load. Now, if we then entertain the thought of what rest and recovery does, okay, whether you're a novice runner or an experienced runner, this is what rest and recovery does. So let's imagine a tap again opened at the bottom, so that drips out a bit more water, and that you don't get that overflow mechanism. And that's a simple way of sort of giving you a bit of understanding, a bit of an explanation on how important rest and recovery is in avoiding this overload. And the eventual outcome of all of this is improved fitness. So you then end up with a glass glass with more water in it, and that's what I would refer to as improved fitness. But that's improved not without this overflow, and that's essentially what you want, whether you're starting to run having never run before, or you start doing some kind of other fitness plan, boot camp or high intensity sessions. What you want is give yourself enough time to recover in between. That's number one. And certainly also make sure that you're getting enough rest, and that in this context is sleep. Hopefully that was that gave you enough of an explanation. I'm happy to take any questions about these things at the end. Anyway, now I'm going to talk to you about strength training, and it's often an area that's regarded by a lot of the runners that I treat. So look, if you were really pushed for time, if all you could do was run 3 times a week or 4 times a week, now this can be done at the end of your running session. So I don't usually ask people to go and run one day and do a strength training the next day, because a lot of people, like I said, in the recreational running population have full-time jobs and families and everything else to manage and juggle. So for me, when you do your run, maybe do your strength training at the end of that sort of session, and you could pick 3 or 4 exercises, and these are often the kind of exercises that I go for, and there are scientific reasons for these as well. So we're talking about things like a single leg bridge, and you can start, and this is a slightly more advanced version, so you can start with a double leg bridge, which would involve the other leg being on the ground as well, and then progress to what I would call a single leg bridge. And you could then do squats, and I've used this particular picture because you can make use of children for these exercises. Although my wife would hate me for saying that. So that's another exercise. And calf muscle. Both these exercises at the bottom of your slide, bottom of your page, are loading the calf muscles. So the important thing to understand, guys, is in running, in steady speed running, in long distance running, calf loads are really great. Okay, as in the amount of load that you put on your calf muscles when you run are phenomenally greater than you do in the quads, as in your thigh muscles or your buttock muscles, right? So although these exercises are important, the calf exercises are really important. So now, what I would also say is, you could do calf exercises on a step. If you had some weights that you can hold on, like a dumbbell in one hand whilst you do them, that loads the calf muscles more. If you sit down and do a calf raise in a seated position, that again loads a different part of the calf, and that's why you need to work both, do both those versions of calf raises. And those are a few exercises that I've pointed out. And even if you said you're going to do about 3 sets of each exercise, and that's why I've written some of these things down here. Now, if we talk about each exercise, I would say, let's say, for example, if you did 3 sets of this exercise, and the important thing is the numbers. So the exercise should be hard enough to bring about a strength change. Now, if it's really easy for you, you're not really going to get very much in terms of strength gain. So that's why when I said earlier about using a weight when you do a calf raise, so it needs to be hard enough. So by the 8th or 10th repetition of that exercise, you should find that it's pretty hard going. You can't really do another one. So the intensity or the load has to be greater. So that's what I'm referring to. And if you did 3 sets of each exercise with a 2 to 3 minute rest in between. And this is also important because again, that allows you to get the best outcome when you follow a plan, a strength plan like this. And finally, what I would say here is if it's possible, if you're going to sign up for a marathon or a half marathon or something coming up, make sure you give yourself enough time beforehand. So you give yourself maybe 6 weeks or 8 weeks that you start engaging in a strength program like this, and then you start increasing your running volume. And in the same instance, if I was talking about a novice runner, I would again say, make sure if you've already started running, I'm not going to say stop running. I'm going to say make sure that you start this as well. And it's got a big role to play, whether you're talking about improving your running performance as an experienced runner, whether you're talking about preventing injury, whether you're talking about improving running economy. All of these things can be achieved by you engaging in a good strength program, okay, strength training program. So that's what this particular slide is about. Okay, now this next slide is more about what's referred to as plyometric exercises. So these are jump related exercises. Now, again, this is all about showing a few options, giving you guys a few options. Now, these things are also shown to be quite important in terms of helping runners, but probably not as important as the previous slide that I spoke to you about. But just as an idea, I'm going to show you some of these videos. So these are jump related exercises. As I said, that's one plyometric exercise, and the difference between this and the slide that I showed you before is that when you do exercises like these that involve a fast movement where you're actually leaving the ground and generating force again quite quickly, this is very similar to what happens when you run. When you're doing strength training, so the previous slide that I showed you with all those exercises, although you get strength gains in muscles, you're not necessarily preparing your muscles and other soft tissues for the kind of load that they would incur when you run. So these kind of exercises have a different role to play in that context. So there is a role to play for these kind of exercises. These are, most of your physiotherapists will speak to you in volumes about plyometric exercises. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions on this towards the end of the discussion today. And the last thing I will talk to you about as well here is training program. Now, for those of you that are more experienced runners, this is more important, right? The amount of low intensity running that you do, and again, in terms of preventing injuries, this is important because most of us get into this rut of running at the same speed for long periods of time and repeat the same kind of thing again and again and again. The problem with doing that, though, is we tend to run out of our metabolic reserves, and what ends up happening is we overtrain, essentially. Okay, and that doesn't help performance. So there's this particular book. Do make a note of this if you're interested. There's a particular book that was written by an author, by the author Matt, that is M-A-T-T, Fitzgerald, and he wrote a book called 80-20 Running, and polarized. And it's been termed as polarized training program, polarized as in being two opposite ends. So 80% of your running at low intensity, and that's less than 75% of your maximal heart rate. The easy way, let's not complicate it too much. What I want you to understand is when I say low intensity running, it's at a conversational pace. So when you run, you should be able to, go through the alphabet from A to Z without hyperventilating, or you should be able to maintain a conversation with your running partner without struggling. So that's your low intensity running, and most of your running that you do should be at that speed. And for a short percentage, so we're talking about more like your 20%, and that's why it's called 80-20. 20% should be at a high intensity or higher intensity. Now you can vary a little bit. So you can say 85% at lower intensity and maybe 15% at high intensity. And high intensity I'm referring to is more than 90% of your maximal heart rate. So speed training, for want of a better word. But what appears to happen is even in recreational runners, this kind of a training program has been studied against a program that entails you running at the same speed for long periods of time. And what we've actually found is that improved performances seem to come about when you engage in a program like this, as opposed to just running at the same speed all the time. So for me, when I'm talking about a training program for runners, this is really important. I talk to most of my runners and most of the people that I treat about polarizing your training program based on some of the research that we have. An 80-20 model is a very point for that. So I would certainly ask you to go and maybe read a little bit more, or if you want to learn more, by all means get in touch with me, and I'm happy to sort of share the information that I have on it. So that's a few things that I want to go through now. The next couple of slides are myth busting slides. Now, earlier in one of the slides, I showed you that a lot of the runners, in fact, seem to believe that the trainers that they wear or the sneakers that they wear have a big role in preventing running injuries. Sadly, the research doesn't prove that, and there's a lot of. It's a very controversial topic. It's a heavily market-led sort of area, and you will often find various contradicting sort of terminology. But the vast majority of studies that have looked at matching people to trainers based on foot type, for example, didn't report that injury rates were any lower. So that's one of the things that I would say, and I will also talk to you a little bit about osteoarthritis, and it's a scary topic for a lot of the general population, but it isn't, really shouldn't be scary. So talking a little bit more about runners or trainers, I'll just briefly mention a few things. Now, if you go to a running store, you'll find obviously several more trainers, but you'll find various varieties of them, and I'll sort of put a few out here. Now, you have maximalist trainers, for example, these ones here, and you have minimalist ones, and there have been sort of several studies that have looked particularly at whether injury rates are lower if you use these trainers as opposed to these trainers, as in maximalist trainers. Really, like I said earlier, there really doesn't seem to be a big shift in the numbers. So there's no one magic solution when it comes to trainers. What I would say to you is, if you've always used a particular make of trainers, a type of trainer, then make sure that you rotate. Maybe get 2 pairs of the same trainer, and maybe rotate them on a weekly basis. And comfort seems to be important. Don't necessarily go and invest in a new pair of trainer because you've read somewhere that they prevent injuries. At the moment, we don't really have a particular type of trainer that seems to lower all risk of injury in runners. So make sure that you don't get sucked into that sort of process. The only thing I would say is there is one particular paper that was published in 2016 that suggested that people who have a particularly pronated or overpronated feet, so flat feet we're talking about, they seem to suffer more injuries if they or suffer less injuries if they had what's known as motion control trainers. So those are trainers that prevent that overpronation mechanism, or increased sort of flat foot foot contact. So there's one particular paper, but what I would say here is be clear. If you've got a comfortable pair of trainers, stick to them, and be reassured that there is no one trainer that prevents all injuries in runners. Hence, there is no panacea. Okay. I'll talk to you a little bit about osteoarthritis, and it's one of those things that I get questions that I get asked a lot. Now, does osteoarthritis worsen with or in runners? Now, there's a plethora of research in this topic, but the main thing I'd say is I've cited 2 papers here. Now, this is a massive study, and we look at the number of people involved in the study, over 100,000 from various different countries, and they looked at runners, people, and non-runners, and what they actually found is in runners, the percentage of hip and knee osteoarthritis, so this is the degenerative arthritis we're talking about, is around 3.7%, whereas in non-runners it's more than 10%, right? So it appears that running itself does not seem to increase your chance of developing osteoarthritis. That's what I would say if you are already a runner. The only thing that they cited was that if you ran more than 45 to 50 kilometers per week for over 15 years, then you seemed to have a higher rate of osteoarthritis. So it increased to something like about 11%, so fairly close to non-runners. But then if you ran less than that, and it doesn't seem to have a role in terms of developing osteoarthritis, or in fact worsening of osteoarthritis. So don't let running, don't let osteoarthritis or the fear of osteoarthritis put you off when it comes to wanting to run. And one other thing I would mention here is, again, similar sort of figures, and these guys also looked at a big population, and they found that the prevalence of osteoarthritis was far less in more active population than it was in less active population. So interestingly, these guys reported that if you had serious injuries in the past, so again we're talking about knee and hip here, so if you had previous big injuries in the knee, so things like you may have had big ligament injuries in the knee, for example, or if you've had previous surgery on the knee or hip, so arthroscopy, so keyhole surgery, for example, that seems to increase your risk of developing osteoarthritis more than running seems to. Okay, so don't worry too much about osteoarthritis worsening in terms of running. Okay, so for me, this is my last slide, and I'm happy to take questions after this. Now I coined this, so core 4. For me, these are the 4 important things in terms of injury prevention, and all of these things are things that I've already covered, and I just wanted to put everything together in this particular slide. So what I will cast your attention to is the progressive increase, and the progressive increase in training loads. Now, remember I spoke to you about, you don't want that increase in mileage to be steep. You want it to be less steep. Take as long as you want to increase your mileage, and you're far less likely to suffer with injuries if you did that. So that's one of the core 4. Second thing we spoke about earlier was strength training. Now, again, I've mentioned that, and obviously that's also a really big part in preventing running-related injuries. Rest recovery, I've spoken to you about that as well. I mean, it's really important, and it's often disregarded or not emphasized on enough, and that's really not good enough, to be honest, from a health professional's perspective. So make sure that we get these things organized, and also, of course, finally vary the speed and the intensity. And that's when I spoke to you earlier about that that polarized model of 80-20. Now, particularly if you're an experienced runner, if you're a novice runner who's just setting out with something like a Couch to 5K challenge, for example, which was written for people who essentially have never run before, it's a very good program to follow, by the way. If you're wanting to start a running program, that's probably one of the best ways to start, because it's a very progressive way of gradually getting somebody who's never run before to be able to run 5 kilometers over a period of about 9 to 10 weeks. So that's a good plan to follow. So that's what I mean about our progressive thing. So, but then if you're doing something like that, then this whole thing about varying the speed and intensity may not be as important. But if you are an experienced runner who wants to improve performance, who wants to participate in a marathon or a half marathon or multiple marathons over a year or a season, then you really need to be thinking more about your varying your speeds and trying to plan your training program based on that. So for me, when I say core 4 injury prevention strategy, this is something that I've coined. This is mine. This is my personal take on it. You may not find this elsewhere. If you listen to various experts on running injuries around the world, they'll all have their own take. This is my personal take on it, and this is what I would use to educate people when it comes to preventing running injuries. Now, last thing I'd say about all of this is, please remember that not one thing is more important than the other, right? All of these things are important. And I'll stop with that, I think, for today, for now. And I'll open this up to you guys now. Of course, Ramki and anybody else who has any other questions, I'm more than happy to answer.
Sam, it was an excellent presentation. I mean, a lot of important stuff, a lot of important things, especially how to prevent injuries and stuff. And one of the important slides that took my attraction was like the osteoarthritis. You know, that is a common question I get asked every single time. Will my arthritis get worse with running? Can I keep running? You know, and other things. So those were good. And I think you've done a good job by, you know, saying about experienced runner and new runner. I think those are like very, very, very good points. So I'll let everybody to ask their questions. I think Sham has a question on shoes, or he has some.
Yep.
Yeah. So I'll let everybody ask their questions. I'm going to unmute people. So mute yourself, you know, or unmute yourself. That way you guys will, you know, you can ask your questions. Looks like Vivek has a question, Sam.
Yeah.
Hey, Sam, that's a great presentation. Thank you. Hey, Sam, can you hear me?
I can. Vivek,
Yes.
Thank you. Carry on. Yeah.
Yeah, just regarding the footwear, I'm not as an expert like you, but I feel like what's your take on running on these surfaces, hard surface, soft surface? What's your take on it? And what's your take on intrinsic foot muscle exercises for, I know you have focused on larger muscle groups, but what's your take on intrinsic foot muscle exercises?
Okay, so firstly, with the surface, now, what you have to remember is if you're running on a hard surface, then the surface is stiff, for example, right? And your leg doesn't have to produce as much of the stiffness that's required to propel you forward, right? It's what's known as leg stiffness. When you're running on softer surfaces, your leg has to work actually harder. So contrary to some of the common belief that if you run on softer surfaces, you're less likely to suffer injuries. That's not necessarily accurate, actually, because when you run on softer surfaces, your soft tissues in particular, so your muscles and your tendons, for example, your Achilles tendon, has to work a lot harder. So I wouldn't say one is better than the other. I just think that you need to prepare yourself well enough. Any changes any changes that you want to throw into your training, do it on a more gradual basis. And the second question was around, I think, the intrinsic foot muscles. Now, I think to discuss that, I think we'll need to sort of slightly take some of the evidence to some of the other bits, so some of the other sort of kind of injuries. It appears that if you work on intrinsic foot muscles, you can increase your things like your jump height, for example. But in terms of running injuries, I'm not really sure it has a big role to play. Certainly, there is no evidence today that I can share with you that would help inform you, any more than you already know. So for me, I would focus my attention on bigger muscles, calf, quadriceps, so your front thigh muscles, definitely your buttock, hamstring muscles, as well as excuse me. Yeah, so those are the sort of muscles that I would focus my main attention on when you talk about strength training. I hope that answers your question, Vivek.
Oh, yeah, that's brilliant. Thanks, Sam. And
Next is Nishant. Okay. Nishant has a question for you, Sam.
Yep.
Yeah. Hello, Sam. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Please carry on. Yeah.
All right. So first of all, that was a very good presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question is, we get to hear, nowadays about barefoot running.
Yeah.
So I would like to, like you to talk about or touch base on the barefoot running a little bit. How do you see it? And, if you see any benefits with the barefoot running, and how much we should include that in our, in our running practice.
So, yeah, I mean, this barefoot revolution started, I think, in 2009 or something like that. The key here is to understand that if you are somebody who who is used to running in standard trainers, for example, right? And you wanted to transition or you wanted to become a barefoot runner, you need to make sure that you do that over about 4 to 6 months. Okay, that's important, because when you go from maximalist trainers or even standard trainers, you have cushioning in your trainers. But when you go to bare feet or minimalist trainers, which is what you're referring to, Nishant, is you obviously don't have that cushioning. So what happens is the load when you run with standard trainers is a lot higher in places like the knee or the hip. But when you run a bare feet or when you run with minimalist trainers, there's a lot more load accumulation in the foot and the ankle area. Okay, so what seems to happen is people seem to suffer with things like soft tissue problems, either Achilles problems, plantar fasciopathy, or even bone stress injuries when they transition too quickly. So barefoot running, if you have already become a barefoot runner and are experienced in doing that, that's fine to keep doing it, right? But if you are somebody who's used to using standard trainers or maximalist trainers, and you wanted to move down to a minimalist or barefoot running, please make sure you give yourself a good 4 months to 6 months to gradually increase the time that you run in those new shoes, so that the amount of load that you're putting on the foot is minimal, and it's not sudden increase. And that sudden increase is often what leads to an injury.
Yep.
That makes sense?
Yep. All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Sam, the next person is Rahul Bharadwaj.
Hi,
Yes,
Sam. Hi, Sam. Great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, my question is, regarding like, the runners who, like 40 plus, and as we grow older, right, the body gets stiff, the muscle group get tight. I'm trying to understand the relationship of like the stiffness in general on like, the injuries, various injuries we talked about. And should we be focusing on stretching? I know you touched a little bit on that, but should we be doing a balance between strengthening and stretching to kind of create the harmony,
Yeah, that's a good question, actually, Rahul. But the fact is, some flexibility issues. So, for example, ankle joint flexibility. So, imagine this is my ankle joint, and if you didn't have enough of this movement, okay, what seems to happen is certain injuries like Achilles injury appears to occur more commonly in those people who have poorer flexibility of that ankle joint, for example. But there is no specifics on general flexibility being lower and that increasing the risk of injury in other joints, unfortunately. But look, you're right in certain ways. So if you've always engaged in stretching before you run, I never say, don't stretch. That would be a silly thing for me to say. What I would say though is it does not seem to play as much of a part as we feel it does in preventing injuries. For me, what would be more important in something like running, we're talking about long distance running. What actually happens is when you set out and walk for a few meters, increase your speed into a jog and then run, what seems to happen is that in itself seems to warm you up nicely, okay, to be able to run. So stretching per se does not seem to have a big role, and that's the evidence that we have at the moment. So if you always stretched before you run, I'd say don't stop doing something that has worked well for you. That'd be silly of me to say that, but I wouldn't emphasize as much on stretching as I would on strengthening. Strengthening seems to have a far bigger role to play in preventing injury, also in improving performance. So for me, when you talk about balance, strengthening tips the balance more than stretching.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
The next person is Arvind. Arvind?
Yeah, just a minute. Yeah, sorry. All right. Hi, Sam. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. Yeah, hi. So I have two questions. Just to set the context, according to your language, probably I would fall under a recreational runner, but I've been running for a long time, more than 10 years now. But my two questions I've always been confused about is the strength training. The strength training, when you say strength training, do you recommend runners to focus on doing the strength training between the running days or after running? Like say if I run 5 miles a day, after the run, do you recommend to do the strength training for 15-20 minutes, or you recommend in between the days you run? That is question number one. And the question number two that I have is, how important is the form or the posture of your body while you're running? Does that attribute to any body injuries? If so, how can we correct ourselves from a posture standpoint?
Okay, so if we deal with your first question about when would you strength train and when would you run, what I would say is if you run, let's say 3 days a week, okay, so let's say Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday, for example. Now, what I would do is I would do my running. I would come back, as soon as I, come back home. And if you were not a member of a gym, then I would come back home and I would just do all my strength training on that day after my run. Okay. And the reason, the scientific reason behind that is you then allow yourself 48 hours rest and recovery. Okay, this is important, particularly in the sort of masters age group, so runners on the other side of 40 again, and because when you run one day and then you strength train another day, you're not giving yourself enough time in between those sessions to allow for recovery or sufficient recovery to happen. That is my logic on that, and there is enough science, particularly in soft tissue injuries like tendon injuries. You need to make sure that you give yourself enough time. So I would say always do your run and do your strength training at the end of your run, and then nothing for 2 days. And that would be my suggestion. Okay. And the second question was regarding posture of running. Now, certain studies have looked at what's known as chi running, which is, if you imagine, this is the shape of my, this is the posture of my body. If I was to lean with myself leaning forward ever so slightly, so transferring load forward rather than transferring a lot of vertical oscillation, as it's known, that seems to reduce the risk, or seems to reduce the load on something like the knee joint, for example, right? So there is some evidence to support something like that. And there is also an argument to say that rather than changing your posture when you run, because running is a natural thing, right? So you shouldn't have to think too much about it. You should just go out and run, particularly for somebody like you who's run for so many years. What may be important though is if you think about your step rate, so number of steps per minute, so cadence as it's known, for example. So if you said, for example, your standard, your average cadence was, say, something like 165 steps per minute, okay, for example. If you then said, I'm going to increase it by around about 5% or 7%, for example, right? Just as an example, what that would mean is that you're taking more number of steps per minute, which then means that you're not spending as much time in the air, which again does the same thing. So you transfer more of your load going forward than up and down. So you could look at your cadence. You could look at maybe slightly improving your cadence, and also there is some research suggesting that if you increase the cadence by about your cadence by about 5% to 7%, you can sometimes minimize certain risks of injury. That's a little bit controversial, though. Some experts don't believe that can be done. So I would say for somebody like you, Arvind, don't worry about changing your posture, right? If you always run, if you run for a long time and it has served you well, don't throw something new into the mix. I would definitely say engage in strength training. Definitely for more than one reason. But changing posture of an experienced runner, unless you came to me with an injury and I changed your cadence to rehabilitate you, that's a different question. I wouldn't just change something to prevent injury. That's not possible.
Okay,
Not
good.
necessarily.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the next person, Sam, we have two more people. Ram Pai is next, and then we have Gopinath after Ram.
Okay, man.
Ram? 1 second. Ram,
Yeah.
give me 1 second, Ram. Yeah.
Yeah, can you
Yeah,
hear me?
now I can.
Yeah,
now we can
I
hear.
can, Ram. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful presentation. And since I'm coming last, I think you have covered and many of the questions that were asked, I was going to ask. But anyway, I just have, wonderful program so far. So the two things that I have is, you mentioned doing the strength training right after a run. And number two, the question that I have is, how do you increase your cadence per minute, or from 170 to 180 or 5% or so. So do you take faster steps and shorter steps to increase the cadence? And also, if I'm running 5 days a week, and how many times do I need to do the strength training right after the run?
Okay, so in terms of improving or increasing your cadence, the reason I said I mentioned 5% to 7% is because if you increase your cadence by more than 10%, what's been shown to happen is your metabolic cost, so your effort of running seems to increase exponentially. So it's not advisable to do that. So anything less than 10% is okay. Okay, that's the first point. Second point, but how you increase your cadence. Now, the simplest way that I use, and that I use when I'm rehabilitating somebody from an injury, is I use what's known as a metronome. You may have heard of it already.
Yes.
Yeah, so you could download a free metronome app onto your phone, plug it into your earphones, and basically it beeps a number of times a minute. So if I say, for example, you set it at 175, okay, it would beep 175 times a minute. And if you are out for a 40-minute run, for example, I would say maybe for the first 4 or 5 minutes, or maybe even for the first, let's say for the first 5 minutes, you run at your natural cadence, right? Then for about 1 or 2 minutes, so maybe the 6th, 7th minute, listen to the metronome and coordinate your foot strike, each foot strike to the metronome, right? But the other thing is, obviously, if you listen to 175 beep, 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 beep for 40 minutes, you'll go crazy, right? So I'd say you listen to it for 1 or 2 minutes, and then cut out, listen to something else for another 5 minutes, and then come back to it for another minute after the next 4 or 5 minutes. So over a 40-minute run, you maybe listen to it about 4 times, 5 times for each minute, for a minute at each instance. Yeah.
Yes.
So the best, the simplest, easiest way of increasing your cadence is by using a metronome, which is really easy to download and use, and most runners love it. And when you particularly will talk about injury rehabilitation, it has a role to play.
Got you. Thank you.
Is that okay, Ram?
Yes, excellent.
The next person is Gopinath.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes,
I can, Gopinath. Yes.
Hey Sam, great presentation. Thank you for your time. A quick question on the heart rate based training. So what is the role of heart-based training, and how do we measure heart rate? So the reason I'm asking is I'm always find myself in either zone 4 or zone 5. Should I be worried about it, or is it a good thing to follow?
Okay. So do you use a heart rate monitor when you run, Gopinath?
I have a wrist-based monitor, like the regular whatever Garmin device we use.
Okay. So the first thing I would say is wrist wearable devices. The accuracy of measuring heart rate is not particularly great. Okay, and that's based on most of the evidence that we have. So if you're measuring heart rate, you better invest in something like a heart rate monitor. and different makes make them. It's quite easily. You wear it across your chest in a vest or something like that. And the second thing I'd say is you're talking about zone 4, zone 5, and that's in a 5-zone model. I think you're referring to. Now, what I would ask you is, when you say you're always in zone 4, zone 5, are you telling me that? I mean, how often do you run?
I usually run 5 days a week.
Okay, so do you mean that every run that you do, you're in that zone?
Yeah, most of the time spent is in zone 4 or zone 5. It's usually between more than like 160.
And what sort of distances do you tend to run?
Usually 5 miles, about 5 miles.
Okay, so what I'd say to you is, first of all, if you're measuring heart rate, accuracy with wrist wearables is not great. So maybe invest in a heart rate monitor. And the second thing I'd say is, you're probably running too fast, okay, which is why your heart rate is a lot higher. If you wear a device that measures heart rate accurately, and that still tells you that you're in zone 4, zone 5, then it just means that you're running way too hard. Okay, so what you need to do is, remember I spoke to you about that 80-20. What you probably need to go and think about doing is maybe about 4 of those runs in the week, run at a slower than your self-selected speed. So you know the speed that you run at, run a bit slower than that. That would drop your heart rate into more of a zone 3 kind of range, and that's important. Right? And then one run in a week, do a shorter run, but let that be faster. That you spend your time in that zone 4, for example, right? But that difference seems, and if you did that over a 6-week time frame, you'll actually find that you're far fitter week 8, week 9, after having done that for about 6 weeks. And that's certainly what the research has shown us so far. So 2 bits of advice. Don't rely on wrist wearables for measuring heart rate. You need a heart rate monitor. 2 is, after having done that, if you're still in zone 4, zone 5, a lot of the time, you're probably running too fast, and there's a number of problems in doing that. And your things like your recovery after each run is going to take a lot longer, and your immune system function is also going to be it's going to be depleted. So it's probably not a good practice. So those would be my 2 bits of advice for you. Does that make sense, Gopinath?
Yep, makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sam, next question is from Gladstone.
Yep.
Glad, are you there? Give me 1 second, Sam. Yeah, he's unmuted. I can hear
Sam.
you.
Hi, Sam. Hi, Ram.
Hi, Glad.
Hey, Glad.
Good to see you all, man. It was good speech. I have one question. Like you mentioned that footwear doesn't make a huge difference. But I personally believe that like if you have somebody with a flat foot or a high arch, or somebody with some foot things like custom-made shoes or insoles can make a huge difference, right? Could you just briefly talk about that, Sam?
Yeah, part of that I have to disagree with that. Sorry, that may be your experience, but generally the evidence does not suggest that that's the case. The one interesting thing you mentioned about flat feet. Now, that's what I was talking earlier. There's one particular study that has shown that people, particularly people with really flat feet, if they don't have motion control, and that's supportive footwear, if you like, that's not insoles, that's this motion control technology within the trainers. So when they have those trainers, they seem to suffer less injury. So what I'm saying is, if you see somebody if you have particularly flat feet, and if you or if you don't have enough motion control technology in your trainers, then there may be a slightly increased risk of you developing injuries. That is the one thing that research has proven so far. But big research, if you look at thousands and thousands of people in the military population, general population, what we know is that whether you fit the patient or the person in a pair of trainers based on the foot type or not, it doesn't seem to influence the injury rate. So, I think I think it's very controversial, but for me, the only thing I'm conscious about is if they've got particularly flat feet, and if they are presented to me in clinic with an injury and they have flat feet, then I may recommend motion control trainers. But that's not in everybody's case. I certainly wouldn't agree or accept that.
I agree with you, Sam. I've dealt with that. I'm one person against those insoles too. So yeah.
Okay, guys, but I personally believe that Nike sucks. I have used other shoes, but but I don't like those brands. But some of the other brands are much better. So
Okay.
that's my take on it, guys.
Okay,
Thanks, Glenn.
okay,
Thank you. Hey, Sam, one last question. I don't see anybody raising their hands. Okay, one last question from a person who couldn't attend the program today. So this is from Mr. Sharma. Basically, the question is the tightness and discomfort on one side of the hip radiating through the hamstring muscle. It may be related to structural imbalance. How do we address this issue?
That's slightly difficult, Ramki. I think we need to.
I think
consultation.
I'll explain it to him. So I'll give your info to him just in case of another question, or I'll actually explain it to him. So I just have to say it to you, so because he has mentioned it as a question. So
yeah, no, that's fine. But yeah, maybe he needs to come and see you in clinic.
Yeah.
But sorry, I can't give you specific information. That needs more of a consultation.
Exactly.
I'll
take care of that.
Sorry, Mr. Sharma.
Yeah. Sam, looks like Glad has one more question for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So sorry, guys. Just one more question. It's from my friend. Okay. He's a black guy. He's a very fit guy. He used to run like all his years, but he used to play also basketball. But 6 months back, he had a tendo Achilles tear. From then, he's having a lot of trouble, like to run. Usually, he complained that his PT asked him to do a lot of plyometrics, like spot jumping and jumping on a 18-inch. What is it called? A step stool. He has more trouble doing that. So, do you have any specific thing to help him,
Do you mean he had a complete Achilles rupture or a partial Achilles tear?
Partial rupture.
Okay.
He was on a cast for 6 weeks.
Okay. I think again we need a bit more information there, Glad. I think what I'd say is if that was 6 months ago and if he's already begun plyometric training, now whether he wants to return to running or basketball, I would say plyometric training is really important for him in terms of returning to normality. Particularly if he's going to go back and play basketball, it would be far more important. But yeah, I don't think what he's been asked to do is incorrect. I think he should be doing what he has been asked to do. If he's still got pain generally with Achilles ruptures and rehabilitation from Achilles ruptures can take a lot longer to recover. So yeah, ask him to hang in there and keep working at it. I'm sure it will get better in time.
He feels better, when he uses a brace or something in his feet. So, do you recommend that he should use that for a longer run?
Heat. So, what did he say? Heat.
Brace.
No, a brace.
A brace now.
Ankle support or a brace. Yeah, it's been 6 months now.
Absolutely no evidence to suggest that at all. No.
Okay, Sam. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome, Clark.
Sam, I think it went way past what we thought, but it was an excellent presentation once again.
Yes, sorry, man. I've taken a lot of your time.
No, actually, exactly. I mean, I'm so thankful for all of them because they've asked wonderful questions. So, I mean, that's why I was not suggesting anything because I know most of the runners in the group that have asked questions. So, I mean, these are very important questions and, it's an important topic for everybody. Once again, guys, like Sam is mentioning, the evidence for anything like, insoles and stuff, like I always also mention to you, it's not that much compared to, walking with your own, running with your own muscles. So that'll be better. than putting brace. I know psychologically a lot of us feel better. My personal preference, I know my friend will agree with it. Please do not strengthen your brace, strengthen your muscles. That is what is more important. You're running for a reason. Might as well, help your muscle than anybody, than your brace. So with that being said, guys, any questions, let me know. I'll connect you guys with Sam. I have all his information. Once again, thank you so much, Sam, for your time. And I'm going to, tomorrow's presentation, guys, it's at 1:30 in the afternoon Eastern time. The presenter is Shyam Sundar, one of our college mates, and currently he is his IPL team is SRH. If he was in the team, he wouldn't have given us this time. So thanks to COVID in a good way. So Shyam is going to talk to us on an important topic, preparation for sports and fitness and importance of hydration and nutrition. Please, please, please do log in. It's going to be an important topic. Shyam has like experience with almost 10 different cricket teams. And he also is what do you call physical therapist for a tennis team. I mean, I can read his profile, but keep on reading it. But I'll let it for tomorrow. And thanks, Sam and Shyam. Looking forward for your presentation at 1:30 tomorrow. Guys, have more questions. I think this was very interactive, and we'll keep going. Thank you all for your support.
Thank you very much, guys. I hope you found it useful.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Bye.
Yeah.